Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. So I'm Alex Campbell. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a policy analyst at the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center. I focus on climate issues, including disaster recovery. With me today is Noah Patton from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, also focuses on disaster recovery. So we're going to be talking about the CDBG-DR program, its role in disaster recovery, and then North Carolina's state action plan. This action plan outlines the way in which the state's planning to use the $1.4 billion that they've received in CDBG-DR funds. The point of this webinar is to give you an overview of the program and the plan so that you will be in a position to leave public comments on the program, on the plan. Um, so we're going to spend about 30 minutes, Noah and I, going over CDBG-DR and the state action plan. And then we're going to reserve the latter half of the hour for Q&A. If you have questions, you can drop them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you click it, you should get a little box that pops up where you can leave those. You can leave them at any time, and they'll just start accumulating, and then we'll get to those come Q&A. And just so everyone knows, this webinar is recorded and we'll be sharing resources afterwards. All the resources that we use, so the slides and everything, so that will be available afterwards. So with that, I think we're going to get started. Noah's going to kick us off. Go ahead, Noah, take it away.
For sure. Thanks, Alex. Let me this. Okay, nobody look. Okay, now you can look. How's it going? My name's Noah Patton. Pronouns he, him. I'm the manager of disaster recovery at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Today we're going to be talking about CDBG-DR, or HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. Good shorthand is just HUD long-term recovery. So just a little bit about NLIHC. Founded in 1974, we're solely dedicated to achieving racially and socially equitable public policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes have quality homes that are accessible and affordable in communities of their choice. In addition to a wide variety of housing-related things, we also lead a disaster housing recovery coalition, or the DHRC, that's made up of 900 local, state, and national orgs, working to ensure that all disaster survivors receive the assistance that they need to fully recover. Through that DHRC, we kind of collectively provide, federal advocacy, information sharing, technical assistance, and advocacy support for folks working in and on behalf of disaster-impacted communities across the country. Cool. So we're talking a little bit today about long-term recovery. So, what is long-term recovery? How is that different than short-term recovery? How is that different than disaster response? So FEMA is required by law to close its programs 18 months following a disaster, with a big old note that this can be extended, and should be extended. So folks should keep that in mind as we get closer to the 18-month mark for that. So obviously, and I'm sure you could tell, for large-scale disasters, it's very unlikely that FEMA actually, fully assists a community in fully recovering by that 18-month mark. There's a lot of things that are still to be done, and FEMA's kind of focusing more so on just kind of patching up infrastructure, making sure that it's just working, making sure that folks have a roof over their heads, for the most part. Not necessarily kind of permanently creating the infrastructure and housing necessary for the community to thrive in the future, as it's kind of fully bounces back from the disaster and will have new needs and all that good stuff. So this is where HUD's CDBG-DR, or Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, comes in. So as you can see by this very grainy image, this is kind of the disaster recovery continuum, so to speak. Um, and so you can see kind of preparedness is the immediate response, where it's just like we're saving lives and we're trying to save, limit as much damage to property as humanly possible. We're kind of at the short term, that's kind of the emergency sheltering, making sure roads are clear, kind of emergency infrastructure, making sure that there's, kind of trauma-informed initial counseling available, that sort of a thing. And right now, in North Carolina, y'all are in, although sometimes it may not feel like it, in the intermediate kind of recovery phase. So you're kind of trying to find accessible housing solutions in the interim. You're still grappling with debris removal. Things are starting to open back up. Infrastructure is at least functioning, for the most part. And so when we talk about long-term recovery, we're looking at these months and years way to the right of this image, where you're trying to rebuild infrastructure to a level that it wasn't before, so that it's stronger for future disaster impacts, that it might be more robust as folks move around the area, or new folks will move in, or folks, have can kind of relocate within the area. And you're also developing permanent housing solutions, which is, of course, as somebody that works at a housing nonprofit, my favorite part. Um, so what is CDBG-DR? Since 1992, Congress has approved $100 billion through this program to assist disaster recovery. Unlike FEMA, like FEMA has a pot of money already ready to go. When there's a disaster, they just are like, okay, boom, we'll take it from this pot and kind of distribute it out through the public assistance program, through the individual assistance program. But for CDBG-DR, because the program isn't permanently authorized, and we have a bill that would make it permanently authorized, Congress has to approve basically like one-off bills providing money to disasters in a certain time frame. So usually they'll be like, okay, disasters in the last 2 years or something like that. So, but the problem with it is it relies on Congress having to do that, which sometimes, depending on the political situation, might be quicker, might be very much longer. Um, so when these funds are approved by Congress, HUD will look at the existing FEMA data on the individual assistance program. That's why it's so important to apply for that FEMA assistance. One of the very many reasons it's important to apply for that. So they're looking at the FEMA data. They're looking at the impacts of the disaster. They're looking at the housing market, homelessness rates, and all of this kind of is calculated into the area's unmet need. So it's like disaster-related needs that have not been met by alternative federal resources. HUD will then divvy out the money, separate it out into states, territories, as well as localities. Just one quick note in terms of like, because you might have seen like Asheville got an individual allocation and then the state got it. That's kind of based on the locality, or like the city or the county or the town's administrative capacity to handle those funds, because this is a large allocation of money. And so, you might, if you're in a small town, you might be handling a allocation of or like a grant fund that's like double your budget, your annual budget. And so you need people to watch it and make sure the money's getting out the door, and make sure that, nobody's running off with it, or what have you. So kind of that is why they'll send some money to the local government. They might send some to the state, and kind of around that. So HUD will also identify the most impacted and distressed areas based on that disaster-related data that they looked at. So 80% of all of the funds have to go to that HUD-identified area. So this keeps state governments honest in terms of where the funds are targeted. Because sometimes, depending on the political situation in a state, there might be an impetus to be like, hey, that's like that's like $100 billion. Like maybe we could, shuffle it around to other folks, that might have been less impacted by the disaster, but might have more political power or something like that. So this kind of HUD identified area kind of is supposed to target in on where the disaster was the worst and who was the most impacted. And so these funds can be used for quite a lot of things. It's flexible because every disaster is different. Now, broadly, 70% of the funds need to benefit low and moderate income households, something that I love about this program. It needs to meet some normal community development block grant national objectives, which I don't have enough time to get into, but suffice to say they're fairly flexible. Broadly, these funds can go to new construction. So where a home or a rental unit did not exist, these funds can create one. That's something that FEMA can't do. They can only replace a homeowner-owned building that was there, that was destroyed. They can replace that, but they can't just build a new one where there wasn't one. They can't add to the amount of housing stock in the area, but these funds can. You can do rehab, reconstruction of homes, just like FEMA assistance. You can also do road and bridge repair. You can repair water and wastewater facilities, as well as a whole slew of economic development things. And so again, it's flexible because it'll depend on kind of the needs of the community, which we'll get into how that factors into this in just a moment. So governments, so when HUD, is like, okay, so we're giving you this much money, that state or local government will create an action plan. This plan details the impacts of the disaster, what are the needs, and how these program funds are going to be used to meet those needs. So the government will work with like stakeholders, which, we like it when they include, community-based organizations and advocates. But often it's kind of more so like other agencies that the government is working with, local governments, that sort of thing, and they'll kind of create this action plan draft. And that's what was recently released for North Carolina. That draft goes up for public review for 30 days. So they're required to have for y'all's grant, that's 3 public meetings at the very least. You can always have more, that's just the minimum. And then they'll also accept comments. We'll get into comments in a little bit. So suffice to say that there's a public review process. If the plan is insufficient, so if HUD looks at it and they're like, well, you don't really have enough about, blank aspect that you're trying to use these funds for, HUD will not reject the plan, but they're going to say, hey, this is a little light on this, and they will work directly with the state or the local government to correct it and then approve the plan. So HUD is kind of reviewing it and they might reject it, but more often than not, I don't think I've ever seen a plan get straight up rejected. So most of the time HUD will just kind of like work and it'll be a dialogue in terms of like, help us understand what you guys want to use that money for, and then they'll be good for it. And then they sign grant agreements and the funds are provided. So this is everything that I just said. Again, if it seems very windy, that is because it is. That's because we need to permanently authorize this program, and I'll share a fact sheet for a bill at the end of this that would do that and at least chop off a couple of these steps. So that's where we're at. We're at the public comment period in the second row there. So as I said, public comment for 30 days. So this public comment period occurs when the plan is released, and then anytime there's a substantive change in the action plan. So periodically, the government will be like, okay, well, the state government will be like, okay, well, we saw this, and actually this is costing more money than we thought, or hey, we've uncovered an additional unmet need that we need assistance with. And so they'll make kind of tweaks to the program. And when that tweak is substantive, then they have to put this back out for public comment. So this is just one in a series of all of these things. And that's to make sure that they're not moving money around without disaster impacted folks having a chance to sound off on it and get notified of that change. Importantly, all of the comments that you provide will go with the action plan to HUD, along with an explanation of how the state is dealing with that comment. Like, what do they think about it? How are they compensating for the issues raised in that comment? So it's a little bit different than normal. So you're not just shouting into the void. Somebody at HUD will read the comment that you submit and ask themselves, like, oh, was the state following that? Or like, what was the state's explanation for that comment? Um, and yeah, they have to address like the actual substance of it. They can't just be like, yeah, we got many comments asking for blah. They have to say, okay, and we've taken that into account by moving this money to this thing or what have you. So there's kind of a mechanism requiring responsiveness to the public comments. I'll also say there is a new aspect to this with the most recent kind of update in HUD's regulations around this program. There is a citizen advisory group that it's required to be created. This is a group of kind of community members that will kind of provide input, advice, and recommendations on the kind of the implementation of the program. So like when the actual kind of like nitty-gritty rules and things are being created, kind of how that works. So they'll be offering their kind of expertise and perspectives on that. And, again, while they have to meet at least every year, again, that is the absolute minimum amount of time that they should meet. And, they should meet more than once a year. Suffice to say, this was actually a thing created advocated for by our friends in Puerto Rico, who were able to get that for some mitigation funds and kind of allowed them a constructed place to have dialogue around aspects of those programs. And I will just say there has been some, successes in terms of, comments actually resulting in kind of reallocation of funds and moving money around, most notably Kentucky, Florida, and Hurricane Ida. As good examples of this. So it is worth the effort to comment on that. I did want to just flag, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but Elon Musk and Doug are planning to cut 85% of the office that oversees this money at HUD, which if you think that sounds like a lot of staff members, that's because it is a lot of staff members, certainly raising kind of questions of speed in terms of how quickly this money can get on the ground, as well as like how quickly questions can be answered about the process. Where if the state's like, hey, can we do this with this? Like, can we, how do you want this labeled or like what have you? If there's not enough people to answer all those questions have to wait and the program slows down as a result. In addition, they made some changes. This isn't fully released yet, but will be this week, I believe. Changes to the program rules that basically remove any mention of civil rights or fair housing, protected classes, any sort of language access, any reporting information on demographics of who's receiving money under the program, who's not receiving money under the program, any mention of climate change, any mention of any requirement involving building codes, and then any requirement involving the federal flood risk management standard. So this just suffice to say, I'm including this solely as an effort to say, like, this will be something because HUD isn't necessarily looking at these things anymore. It'll be all the more important to have folks like yourselves in disaster impacted communities kind of keeping an eye on this, just because we don't have that kind of like, for lack of a better word, like overwatch or what have you, from the federal agency. And so if you're interested in helping out with that, there is a QR code right here where you can contact your member of Congress to be like, hey, how about don't fire the vast majority of HUD's disaster recovery staff, as you're putting out $12 billion in long-term disaster recovery money. So, and that I think is all that I have. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Noah. Very much appreciate that. So, what I'm going to do now is kind of dive into the details of North Carolina's state action plan. So, as Noah just outlined, in order to receive the money, the CDBDR funds that the state has been allocated, they have to make a proposal for how they're going to use these funds and meet the various program requirements. And that state action plan has to go through public comments, and we want you to be able to leave those comments. So that's the reason for doing this. I have something I want to share. Just give me 1 second. Okay, I believe everyone should see that now. So the background to CDBG-DR, I'm not going to go through this because that's just what Noah just gave us. But what I want to dive into is what's in the state action plan. So there are five main programs in our state's action plan. Three that are housing programs and then two other programs. So the bulk of the money is proposed to be used on the reconstruction and rehabilitation program. So this is money that will be used for rebuilding or rehabilitating owner-occupied houses. That includes private roads and bridges to get to those houses. And so it's a program aimed at owner-occupied housing. 57% of the 1.4 billion in total allocation is going to go to this, or that's the proposal at least. The other two housing programs are different. So one is funding the construction of new units for purchase. These are specifically units that are going to be aimed at low and moderate income households. These don't necessarily have to be entirely built from scratch. The money could be used to repurpose existing buildings, to turn those into homes for people to buy. But the difference here is these aren't houses that people already live in. They're houses for people to buy. And the goal here, the reason why they're including money for this is they're hoping to address the inadequate housing production in the region and retain the Western North Carolinian workforce. So this is a much smaller portion of the funds that they're proposing to use for this, only 4% of the total funds. And then the third housing program that they're proposing is one that's aimed at multifamily housing units. So these are restoring housing units, multifamily housing units, as well as promoting the development of new housing units. And these housing units will have rent control. HUD sets limits based on what the maximum rent for these units can be. And 13% of the CDBG-DR funds allocated to our state are being proposed to being used for this. So together, these three housing programs make up the bulk of how the state is proposing to use these funds. As you'll see here in the leftmost kind of column of this table, just over $1 billion is going to be spent on this, or again, that's the proposal, 74% of the funds. Besides these housing programs, there's two other programs that the state's proposing. One is a community infrastructure program. So this provides funding for infrastructure projects that specifically will help communities become more resilient to current and future natural hazards or climate disasters. So they're proposing using 14% of the CDBG-DR allocation for that purpose. And then finally, with this 8% of funds, they're proposing a commercial district revitalization program. So this is money that would go to local governments and nonprofit organizations to carry out revitalization activities in commercial areas. And the goal here is to both create and retain jobs so that people have employment, but also ensuring that people have access to the products and services that they need. So that's the breakdown of the programs. They do set aside 5% of the total allocation just to cover the administrative costs. But again, the bulk of it is going to go to housing, a little bit to community infrastructure, and some for the commercial district revitalization. The other thing that I should flag that I skipped over is in the reconstruction and rehabilitation program, this is the one that's aimed at owner-occupied housing. A portion of the money is dedicated to legal services, case management, and housing counseling. And this is important so that people are able to navigate this process. So that's the breakdown of what the state is proposing. I want to go over a few more details here. I'm scrolling. Don't get sick. Bear with me. So there are certain requirements that the state has to meet in using these funds. Noah mentioned some of these. I want to briefly touch on three. So one is that at least 80% of these funds must go to the most impacted and distressed areas, mid areas. Another is that at least 70% of all funds must be expended for activities that benefit low and moderate income individuals. And so in this map down here, what you'll see is the various mid areas, the most impacted and distressed regions. The red and the yellow areas are the areas that were identified as most impacted and distressed by HUD. The blue and the purple were identified as most impacted and distressed by the state. And the reason why this difference is important is that only 20% of the CDBG-DR funds can go to the state identified mid areas. So the bulk of the funding has to go to the mid areas identified by HUD. The percentages on this map that are underneath each of the county names, these are telling you the share of individuals in each county that are low and moderate income. So this kind of just gives you a sense of where this money is going to be going, where these programs, the programs that I went through just a moment ago, where they'll, where people will be benefiting from them. And then the other kind of requirement or criteria that the state has proposed that they're going to use in distributing these funds is they've done an analysis based on the demographics of the region to look at the various protected classes. And based on that analysis, based on the ethnic and racial composition, for instance, the age distribution, the ages of the populations that live there and whatnot, they've decided to prioritize four protected categories in carrying out these programs. So these categories are elderly households, households with minors, individuals who are under 18, households with disabled individuals, and households with accessibility needs. If you want to see the kind of breakdown as to why, or their explanation as to why they're focusing on these categories, I would encourage you to look at Chapter 4 of the action plan where they go into detail. But what's important here is in order to meet these three requirements that I've outlined, the mid requirement, the LMI requirement, and the prioritization of these protected classes, they're building in a kind of phased application process for the reconstruction and rehabilitation program. That's the program that's rebuilding owner-occupied homes. And so what they're doing is phase one, anyone who lives in one of the HUD identified most impacted and distressed regions are eligible to apply. If you're someone who makes below 60% of the area median income in that county, and you're also a member of one of these protected classes, so you're an elderly household, you're a person who's elderly, you have a minors in your household, etc., then you get first priority. Then, if you're someone who your income is below 60% of the area median income in the county, but you're not in one of those protected classes, you get second priority. Then they move up to people who are in the 60 to 80% range of the AMI, the area median income, starting with those in the protected classes, then those who aren't. That's phase one. Phase two then does the same sort of structure, prioritization structure, but specifically targeting the state identified most impacted and distressed regions. That was mainly the blue regions in the map above. And then finally, phase three, it looks at people who are between 80 to 120% of the area median income in the relevant counties. Anyone who makes more than 120% of the area median income in these counties is not eligible for this program. And that's not the state. That's required by that's part of the CDBG-R program. So that's just to explain how it is that these programs are going to function, specifically how the rebuilding of owner-occupied housing program is going to function, and also how the state plans to meet these requirements, these MID and LMI requirements. There's a couple other things I want to touch on real quick. I realize we're about half an hour in, but I want to talk about one or two more things real quick before we open it up for questions. So another requirement that HUD imposes on the use of these funds is that a certain number of dollars needs to be set aside specifically for the purpose of mitigation. That number, the amount that that HUD has required the state to set aside is 186.3 million. It's about 13% of the total allocation. And the way that the state is proposing to use this mitigation set aside is to just build this into the 5 programs that I've already went through. So in rebuilding owner and occupied housing, a portion of the fund is going to be dedicated to mitigation and resiliency sorts of efforts. Similarly, in revitalizing these the commercial districts, a portion of the funding is set aside specifically for mitigation. And so that's the way the state's proposing to use the money that they have to use for mitigation. Just build it into the programs that they're proposing. And then finally, I just want to give you some kind of like context for how you can like understand why the state is choosing to prioritize the things that they're prioritizing. And that's informed by kind of like 3 different premises, 3 big factors. One is the damage on the ground. They're focusing on those areas that are where the largest damage is, those categories, the largest kind of buckets. They're focusing on things that aren't going to receive funding from other sources. This is a requirement of the CDBG-DR program. It can only be used for unmet needs. That is, needs that aren't going to be addressed by other federal funding sources or just other sources in general. And then, as Noah was also mentioning, these CDBG-DR funds, they can take a long time. They're relatively slow to get where they need to go. And so that's also informing the priorities of the state in devising their action plan. So the 3 largest categories of damages following Hurricane Helene are infrastructure, the economy, and housing. So I kind of want to just briefly go through these to help you understand why so much of the focus is on housing. So the infrastructure damages are by far the largest. But the reason why the state has chosen not to prioritize this and using the CDBG-DR funds is primarily because other federal funding sources are available to cover most of these damages. So with respect to infrastructure damages that aren't related to transportation, so this includes electric, gas, water, sewer, waste, telecommunications, these damages are about 7 billion, but the state's expecting that about 6 billion of this will be covered from other sources, specifically from either federal funding or the private sector. And so after that's factored in, there's an outstanding need of $730 million. It's still quite substantial, but much less than, the 7 billion of outstanding damages in non-transportation infrastructure. Similarly, the transportation infrastructure needs are significant, 10.3 billion, but they're also expecting federal funding to cover most of this. They note that even after federal funding, there still will be a remaining need of 350 million. They propose using 130 million of their funds to cover part of that. And so that only leaves 220 million, and they're expecting the state to cover that. The state's going to need to come in and fill that gap. So there's lots of infrastructure damage, but the reason why this isn't a major priority in the action plan, why they're choosing not to prioritize it, is because they expect that these damages will be covered from other sources. Now, with economic damages, these are also quite substantial, a total of 15.9 billion. Most of this is coming from lost revenue, but a large portion of it is also coming from property damage as well. Um, they're expecting private insurance, various federal grants and loans, state funding, unemployment insurance, and other forms of assistance to cover about 3 billion of the total and 16 billion economic damages. Still leaves a lot. Most of those damages come from lost revenue. And if you're following what's been going on with disaster recovery, you know businesses are in desperate need of support now. Um, we frequently hear how these businesses, small businesses, need grants to stay open. There's a serious threat that so many of these businesses are going to have to close down and won't be able to reopen. But the reason why the state is choosing not to prioritize these business interests in their state action plan is just because of how slow the CDBG-DR funds move. Their explanation is by the time these funds get to these businesses, it's going to be, if they're going to close, they're going to close. And if they're going to get funding to stay open, it needs to get there long before the CDBG-DR funds can get there. And so they haven't made it a major priority to help businesses recoup lost revenue. They do dedicate 111 million to help revitalize commercial areas in the impacted regions. That's one of the programs, as we discussed. But again, that's not a major priority. The major priority of the state with their state action plan is housing. And the reason why is there's substantial housing damages, 15.4 billion. Sorry for the scroll. And given just how long the rebuilding effort's going to take and all the details and the fact that there's not funding sources, federal funding sources to meet these housing needs, the state's chosen to focus on rebuilding the housing. And so that's a kind of broad overview what's in the plan. Um, I would encourage you, if you're interested in the specifics of any of the 5 programs that I went over, to look at Chapter 5 of the plan, where it gives you 2 to 5 pages maybe on each of the different programs. It gives you a lot more details than I was able to go over in this short amount of time. But it will be helpful, I think, if you're interested in, understanding the program better and you're preparing public comments. And then finally, the last thing I want to say is, stop sharing. The last thing I want to say is just to give you an example of some of the kind of recommendations that you might have when you're drafting up your own public comments. So you'll recall that the most of the money is going to owner-occupied housing. A much smaller amount of money is going to multifamily units. So one recommendations that you might have is, well, why is there so much more money going to owner-occupied housing? Maybe we should. Maybe you might propose that the distribution of funds across these 2 housing programs should reflect the distribution of owners and renters in the region. That could be one. Or maybe you really like the fact that the plan explicitly mentions the inclusion of money for legal services. It includes money to help people navigate the application process as they're applying and like going through all the hurdles of getting their home rebuilt. Maybe you really like that. But there's not a lot of information about it. They don't give you a dollar figure about that. They don't tell you exactly, really any details other than that legal service is going to be included. You might recommend that they be more specific. Or maybe you've been following the rebuilding effort in Eastern North Carolina following Hurricanes Matthew and Florence, and you've heard about how people have had their homes rebuilt, and then in less than a year, they're falling apart. And so maybe you think what the state needs to do is build into their plan more robust inspection standards to making sure that the houses that they're rebuilding aren't going to fall apart next year. Or maybe you think they need to include warranties so that if they do start falling apart, the person who received those funds, has some compensation. They have something that they can do about it. There's all sorts of different ideas different, recommendations that you have. I'm not trying to tell you what you should include in your public comments. I'm just trying to give you a sense of like how you might approach this, how you might think about this. So with that, I want to turn to some questions. So let me see. I will start at the top. So we have a question from Austin. I think this is a question for you, Noah. How can organizations get connected to the DHRC?
Yeah, so here, let me pop in the chat a Zoom link that is for our bi-weekly, every other week call. And here is just the main site on our website to learn more with a bunch of different resources and toolkits and so on. But probably the bi-weekly working group is probably the easiest way to get connected. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Noah. So Kelly asks, can CDBG-DR funds be used to expand water and sewer infrastructure for new housing construction? Yes, it can, so long as that's not going to be addressed, like water and sewer infrastructure by other sources. Um, Noah, you agree, it seems like? Yep. Okay. Anonymous question. With the new administration, is there concern about HUD rejecting the plan if it includes reference to climate change, equity, etc.? And I'm going to go directly to the next one because it's the same person. Follow up. Do you have advice on how we should handle our comments if there is a risk that HUD will be using the action plan approval to advance priorities of the administration, such as climate change, equity, etc.? Noah, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I could do that. That's a good question. Um, so thank you for raising it. I would say based on past based on past experiences, I think at most HUD would just say, hey, can you just like delete those and then we'll just approve it. But not necessarily make any like substantive changes to it. It's basically like you can talk about increasing disaster risk without using climate change, but still be like the disasters are getting worse and more often. And so, you can kind of navigate around it. And I think, those folks will largely be kind of hopefully HUD political, not HUD non-political staff kind of looking at that, kind of working through the process. So I think that kind of that's more of a question for I think like how the state would be approaching the negotiations around that, but that's definitely a good question. And then I'll say for the comments, um, I don't know. I mean, it might kind of be the same advice. Although, I think that's kind of a very personal choice to make to be like, hey, do we talk around this issue or do we just straight on, address it? So I'm not going to tell anybody that they can't talk about civil rights if that's what they want to talk about. But you might be like, oh, well, we're worried about the distribution of funds for these areas. And yeah, or, you can kind of couch it a little bit. But again, like that's more of a personal decision than anything. I mean, at the very least, HUD will just be like, oh, well, okay, we just won't pay attention to that part, or you know. Uh, I think there's unlike a lot of additional other federal funds right now, I think there's a lot of political pressure to get these funds out the door. So you can kind of rely on that to kind of circumnavigate perhaps some of the, like DEI concerns or like wokeness concerns about, you know, admitting that like the flooding is going to get worse over the next decade.
Okay, thank you, Noah. And I'm also in the chat. I just dropped a document that kind of outlines some tips for leaving public comments. And we also link to an example of public comments that we, North Carolina Budget and Tax Center, have left on, not on CDBG-DR, but in another context entirely, but just so you can get a kind of like template of how you might write up public comments. They don't specifically speak to the question that was just asked, but they're just more general tips. Um, so Noah, okay, another question for Noah. Your assessment is the HUD cuts would prevent them from getting the most recent CDBG-DR money out the door?
Yes. Yeah. So those are the folks that, you know, oversee where the funds are going, answer questions from jurisdictions about how to use the funds, the reporting requirements for the funds and all of that stuff. And so without them, it would slow the program to a crawl, I would imagine. So, you know, the HUD headquarters office was briefly on sale last week. So, you know.
Thank you, Noah. Um, I'm not sure if you covered this, but can any of these funds be used to support those who need funding to prevent eviction? Um, Great question. I can take a stab at it, and then Noah, if you want to chime in. So my understanding is that that is a permissible use. However, the problem is that people are being evicted now. And given that CDBG-DR funds move very slowly, I suspect that the state would say the same thing about, rental assistance and helping people who are going through eviction as they did with the small business grant proposal, that they're just going to move too slowly to address the issue. But that's just my sense. Noah, what is your impression?
They did remove, there is basically they changed the rules to allow like up to 24 months of rental assistance using CDBG-DR. Um, and I'm never going to tell anybody not to ask for rental assistance. However, to Alex's point, like there might be like quicker ways to get, or like there might be other avenues to get that type of funding quicker, as opposed to CDBG-DR. But again, like the funding of like legal services and things could like directly kind of play into that, where you're boosting up the capacity of legal services in the impacted areas, that could kind of assist in representing tenants at rent court and that sort of a thing.
Thank you, Noah. Not very important, but anyone have any idea why HUD ID'd that one zip code in Charlotte as mid? Yes, so I believe that that was because that they were impacted by this tropical storm that didn't even get a name. But it's been included in, I think it's like Tropical Storm 8, maybe. Don't quote me on that. But a lot of the Helene bill, or at least one of the Helene bills, that our state legislature has passed, has included money specifically for that zip code as well. That's my understanding. Um, Anonymous, are there requirements around rebuilding in place? I understand in Eastern NC there was a lot of inconsistencies and issues with the buyout program and who could rebuild in place versus who was told they needed to move. Was that a North Carolina policy or was that based on federal requirements? So I can speak to the specifics of the current state action plan. So one of the requirements in the owner-occupied housing rebuilding program, is you're not eligible if you live in a floodplain. This is one thing that you might actually leave comments about because many of these people who live in a floodplain lived there before it was a floodplain. And now their houses have been seriously impacted from Hurricane Helene. And they're no longer eligible to have their house rebuilt specifically because of that if the current plan goes through. Um, so that's specifically talking about the current state action plan, specifically about the Eastern NC context. This is not something I know the answer to. Noah, do you have any sense? I mean,
In my experience, it's usually a little bit of both, in terms of state and kind of federal requirements there. I mean, there is a blanket prohibition on building in a floodplain, that I think was impacting a lot of the issues in Eastern North Carolina, if I remembered that correctly. Um, However, there are like you could just build with resilience measurements and measures in place that make it okay. You could elevate the home or something like that. And then I'll also say, just to flag, for better or for worse, there's not, they removed quite a lot of those requirements for this version of the funds. So, that should, at least for better or for worse, be less of an issue, one would hope, right now, or at least based on the CDBG-DR rules side of things.
Thank you, Noah. Anonymous, are there federal requirements or guidelines that dictate the standard to which homes must be repaired or rebuilt after a disaster, particularly regarding resilience? Additionally, are there any federal restrictions on the types of resilience improvements that can be incorporated? In terms of the rebuilding standards for homes, I believe the state action plan specifically mentions North Carolina's building codes are the ones that are relevant. As for the federal restrictions, I'll let Noah speak to that. Do you have any sense about federal restrictions on resilience?
Yeah, they took all those out. So go ham. It actually was always pretty open-ended in terms of HUD money for like, oh, like are you talking about water heaters on the second floor, or like various things. But in terms of like the building codes themselves, they've removed all reference to it. So again, for better or for worse, that will uh be more streamlined this time around. But that might also be a thing that you would want to write a comment about if you want the homes to be more resilient. If you want it to be at a certain standard, you might be like, well, no, even though that's not a federal requirement now that those, homes do be built to a certain standard, you can still advocate for that and push that. And I would encourage that.
Thanks, Noah. So, Anonymous, what is the difference between prioritization for people with disabilities versus those with accessibility needs? Are there situations where someone may have an accessibility need but not qualify as having a disability? Um, yes, I don't know if I have examples off the top of my head, but do you know, Noah?
No, I'd
If not,
say no, I would say drop me a line and then I'll ask the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies. So, yeah, that's better than me like trying to take a crack at it right now.
yeah, I agree. Also happy to look into that if you want to shoot me an email as well afterwards, alex@ncbudget.org. I don't think it's mentioned though. I don't think it's explained in the state action plan. It's just the fact that they treat them as separate leads me to believe that the answer is yes, because otherwise, why would they? Um, Okay, so now Austin. State's action plan is mostly for rehabilitation and rebuilding, but this money can't reimburse people, correct? I fear most people have already paid for repairs out of pocket. Just wondering how you see that playing out. Yes, so the rebuilding program, the rebuilding of owner-occupied housing program, the money never actually goes to the homeowners. It goes directly to contractors. Um, so I don't think that would be an option. Noah?
So that is permitted in the new rules that HUD published at the
Oh,
start of the
okay.
year. So yeah, it's for jurisdictions and for individual applicants. So there is no federal prohibition on like if it was an eligible you're totally eligible for this program, but you just already, spent funds to do it. There's nothing at the federal level stopping reimbursement. So again, that might be something to bring up in public comments. And that could be, I could see that being kind of a separate program or something for folks that were like, okay, we'll reimburse you for the construction materials on these homes or something like that. But yeah, that was a new change from this year based on quite a lot of advocates from around the country pushed HUD on that for that specific point.
Awesome. Thank you, Noah. And thank you, Austin. Great question. I'm actually going to incorporate that in our state act or our comments on the state action plan now. Kelly just says, thanks. Thank you, Kelly, for being here. Oh, Austin, can you give any sense of the volume of public comments they are likely to receive and like how many comments would make for something they really feel like they have to pay attention to? Maybe no way to know, but curious about ballpark. I don't have any sense about how much they usually receive. I've been informed the more they receive, the better. But anything you want to, do you have any sense, Noah?
No, I think the more they receive, the better. As with any kind of public comment. Um, I will say again, because I have to send these comments to HUD and like at least kind of substantively contemplate them, you're also kind of shooting for maybe quality, like quantity is here and then quality is there. So maybe not 100 comments that all say the same like small paragraph, but maybe 50 that kind of elaborate on that would probably be where I'd shoot it for.
Todd asks, can these funds be used in conjunction with other federal funds, specifically IRA, GGRF, like Solar for All? That is a great question. Um, I don't know the answer to that. That is something I want to look into now, and I can get back to you, Todd. Noah, do you have an answer to
So
that?
I know for some federal programs, there's like a grant matching, like you can use CDBG-DR for certain federal match requirements for other programs. I don't know specifically about IRA, GGRF, but I know for things like kind of FEMA public assistance, there is a mechanism in place where you could kind of utilize CDBG-DR as a portion of that fund for a portion of the project. I don't know, it's a 100-page booklet that it's too heavy on procurement, so my eyes kind of glazed over halfway through, but that exists for at least some programs.
Right. Todd, I'm also going to look into that, see if I can find anything specifically about the IRA. That is my purview, and I should know the answer, but I do not.
That some folks in Puerto Rico might have a response or have an idea about that actually.
Okay. Um, so we got, looks like two questions left. Austin and Austin. Okay, Austin, continuing on the floodplain question, that'll be a big problem we'll have up here. Many people with damaged, lost housing own land that is now in a floodplain and unsuitable to rebuild. How does the current plan handle this? What happens with those people? What should we be asking for in our public comment to aid those people? Are you saying those funds should be able to rebuild homes on stilts that will work in the current land for those folks owned broadly? Yeah, so the current plan, the only reference to the people who own homes that were damaged that are currently in a floodplain is just to say that they're not eligible for the home reconstruction program. I think there's a couple different things you could request in the public comments. I mean, I think it makes sense not to just rebuild a home in a floodplain as it was. But there are things you could do. You could pay for the cost of relocation. You could, elevate the home. Those are some things that occur to me. Noah, do you want to add anything?
Is that actually what it says? Is that in the plan? That if you have a
Um,
damaged home in a floodplain, you can't.
you're making me doubt. Let's
I
see.
would I haven't looked through it as deeply as I should. Um, but I will say, so like in Puerto Rico, right? Half the island's a floodplain, and then the other half of the island is a landslide zone. And so that question came up very heavily. I'm sorry for all the Puerto Rico related responses, but it's like topographically, it kind of makes the most sense as an analog, I think. Um, I will say that the big issue there was in terms of like whether you're relocating folks, what assistance are they getting to relocate? They're not just getting like a half price, a voucher for half a price a home and then sent on their way. You're making sure that they are able to access affordable housing that is accessible to them in communities of their choice. And so there's also, so you can either do that or kind of, to your point, mitigation stuff, putting it on stilts. Again, I'm not an environmental scientist, so I won't say how broadly feasible that is, but there's certainly different resilience related aspects to do, and that would be something to comment on in terms of making sure that you're worried about the displacement of those folks from your communities. You want to make sure that the state is kind of utilizing all alternatives to ensure that people can stay where they were. Yeah.
Okay, and so now it is 5:01. There's only one. So yes, it does say that. Um, yeah, I'll also too find. I was trying to, while Noah was speaking, I was trying to find that specific line so I could just pull the quote, but I'm not that quick. But I
Well,
will follow
that's
up
a
to,
thing to comment on then,
yeah, because I remember when I saw it, I was like, that seems concerning. Uh, so. We are over time, so I don't want to. Oh, I want to wrap it up. I know there was only one question left about other potential issues. Hopefully, just in us answering, you kind of got a sense of some of the concerns. Just in wrapping it up, maybe I'll kind of remind you of what those were. The kind of focus on owner-occupied housing as opposed to multifamily units to such an extent that it doesn't really reflect the distribution of owners and renters in the region. This stuff about not rebuilding houses that are located in floodplains, not really much about inspection standards and making sure there's quality control. Another thing that we were interested in is rental assistance. I know we said that it moves kind of slowly, but throwing that out there as a thing to include. Maybe also specifically a reference to making sure that you're using historically underutilized businesses, or maybe union labor when you're rebuilding those houses. Those could be things that you might advocate for. Um, yeah, I'm happy to talk more about this though. If you're still looking for more ideas, shoot me an email, alex@ncbudget.org, and we can continue the chat. With that, we're going to end it. Thank you, Noah, for being here. Thank you for all you who came and participated and asked us questions. I hope you got a lot out of it. We'll send an email tomorrow with follow-up resources. And have a good evening, everyone.